No spoilers here, I promise. In recent episodes of The Curse of Oak Island, Season 11, we were introduced to a group that I know very well and to an individual that I know very well, the Cistercian Order, and their main leader, Bernard de Clairvaux. Bernard, at the age of 16, took 30 male relatives and led them into the failing Cistercian abbey of Cîteaux, of which there were only 2 crumbling houses at that juncture. Now, its main leader at the time, Stephen Harding, welcomed the new influx and enthusiasm and power and finances that this young man brought in, and just plain sheer muscle. He soon outgrew Cîteaux Abbey and was given his own seat of Clairvaux. Clairvaux Abbey took its date from the feast day of John the Baptist, which is also that of the Templar order. Now, you keep in mind, those who are balking at this statement that Bernard was a mastermind, if not the mastermind, behind the Knights Templar order. Here is a group of 9 untried men who, at the Second Crusade, a few of them might have been involved in the First Crusade, it's likely that they were, but they gained real estate that an untried order would not have gained, and that is access to the palace in Jerusalem and also of Temple Mount, and given immediately, without any questions asked whatsoever, access to Temple Mount and the potential lost vaults where sacred texts, treasures, menorah, the ark could have been housed in far earlier centuries. And then they suddenly, up and left, went back to Europe, and then Bernard de Clairvaux assisted in them becoming a official order, and one of the key dates of their inception is 1120, and they were given the same rule of order that Bernard de Clairvaux had written, and wrote the rule of order for the Cistercians and then handed it over to the Knights Templar. So the Cistercians can be said to have created one of the first constitutions in Europe. Bernard de Clairvaux created a federal system where each of its houses, Cistercian houses, were responsible for themselves, but also to the central head, of which his house was the main wellspring. So by the age of 29 years old, he had kick-started the Cistercians and the Knights Templar. Bernard's plan to roll out inexpensive churches and abbeys worked. There were hundreds of them across Europe. The order is still active today. On page 51 of my book, I cite that Clairvaux had grown so quickly. Abbot Bernard was a very simple man who was all about spirituality. He was concerned about the welfare of the poor, and actually, believe it or not, of women too. And his Mariology movement, along with Eleanor of Aquitaine, who focused on the troubadour movement, created an atmosphere where women were thought of to much higher and greater levels than they had been prior in European history. So rather as just simply one of property, suddenly you have Bernard de Clairvaux through the Virgin Mary, but also through Mary Magdalene. He gave his crozier to Speyer Cathedral in Germany, where he traveled to a few times. So the Mary Magdalene Cathedral of Speyer in Germany is very important to him. So you have between he and Eleanor of Aquitaine, the mother of Richard Lionheart, who gave a lot of money and land to Templars. They spur on this reverence for women that did not exist prior. So as a man who was known to travel simply, he rolled mules, rode with a few scribes. He was not overweight like most of what you would see in rich, ostentatious prelates and church officials at the time, who would wear silk and are perhaps not that disciplined either. He wears unbleached white wool clothing, and the Templars would take that on board too and add red crosses to their surcoats. So he's quite opposite from others around him of his day, and he knew it. You know, he lived under a stairwell, believe it or not. He didn't have a large suite in the abbey. He had very small living spaces within the abbey. But that's where his cell was underneath the stairwell. Sounds a bit like Harry Potter, doesn't it? He would have been happier living in the original wooden buildings of Clairvaux, but it was soon apparent they would not suit the demands placed upon them. The charismatic new abbot soon drew some 700 novices to Clairvaux. The overcrowded conditions were relieved by further growth into other European countries, such as England, Ireland, Italy, Germany, Portugal, Sweden, and Switzerland. The power of Clairvaux Abbey would rival that of Rome itself. In fact, he posed a bit of a threat to the Pope. He was a very powerful man, and he preached the Second Crusade at Vézelay, which was built to funnel light into the nave on the summer solstice. And that is where he believed, and many others believed, that Mary Magdalene's relics were kept. Now, of course, she's rumored to be in quite a few places, but Vézelay cannot be ignored as a pilgrimage site for those who follow the Templars and the Cistercians. Bernard de Clairvaux was a clear genius of his day. He changed the face of Europe. He created the Knights Templar, and he was very involved with the crown heads of Europe, including Eleanor of Aquitaine, whose son would eventually own Talmont Castle, mentioned on Zena Halpern's map in the lower right-hand corner. I've devoted 5 chapters on Bernard de Clairvaux and the Cistercians in my book. I am completely in awe of their capacity as engineers, as estate managers, and as scholars. There's a reason why Bernard de Clairvaux sent 9 original knights to Jerusalem, where they would form an alliance with the Venetians, as was seen by later generations in Earl Henry Sinclair joining forces with the Zeno brothers and going, what I believe, back to North America, Nova Scotia in particular. This long-standing alliance with the Templars and the Venetians is well documented. Indeed, they shared the same geographical space in Acre, or Acre, the last stand of the Templars in the Holy Land before being overtaken by Muslim forces. The Venetian quarter is right next to the Templar quarter for obvious reasons: access to ships. Bernard de Clairvaux wanted to know what was happening underneath Temple Mount, and that's why the 9 Templar knights were sent to find relics, to find ancient texts, all of which were brought back to France. Bernard de Clairvaux said that Paris was the New Jerusalem. Why was it the New Jerusalem? Because the Knights Templar found what they were looking for per his direction under Temple Mount, and they brought it back. But it would take time for the Templar headquarters to be built. At that juncture, post 1120 and into 1128, whatever was brought back, I believe, was kept at Saint Denis, at that juncture just north of the city of Paris. Something to think about. There are several structures on the island that we know date to the 1100s, but the one that catches my attention is that of the 1200 AD CE wharf. If you're moving objects of worth and perhaps even weight, or a large accumulation of items, you'd want to do so safely. So if you're going to be embarking off of a ship with important objects, some of which are weighty, such as the Ark of the Covenant. Some of objects could be a large golden menorah. Absolutely possible huge amounts of documents and sacred texts. Wouldn't you want to do so on a wharf that is safe? So if the progression from the Holy Land is to Paris after 1120, after 1128, when these objects are brought back to Paris, somewhere in there, somewhere in that time frame. So Bernard de Clairvaux declares Paris is the new Jerusalem. Why? Because he's got stuff from the Holy Land that shores up and strengthens the Cistercians across Europe, and then the new fighting arm of the Cistercians, the Templars, all under Bernard de Clairvaux. So I guess what I'm saying is, if I were going to take the Ark to Oak Island, it would, and other goodness knows what, it would be 1200 would be the year. And then the archaeoastronomer to 1250. So Bernard de Clairvaux states Paris is the new Jerusalem because he has sacred documents, objects, and they're there, I believe, until around 1200, and then they're moved. That is what I think occurred. So you're looking at a date of 1200 for those objects being moved. And then the new Jerusalem is in Nova Scotia from 1200 on. And Bernard de Clairvaux would have been long passed by then. Something to consider.